Look, I need to get this off my chest because everyone keeps telling me I'm the problem here. And honestly, that's complete garbage. I'm Kaylin. I'm 32. And apparently, I'm some kind of monster because I scrutinized my husband's fidelity, and when he couldn't handle my perfectly reasonable standards, he walked out. Like, excuse me for wanting to be absolutely sure about the biggest commitment of my life. But no, according to everyone else, I should have just blindly trusted the first nice man who came along, because I'm getting older and my biological clock is ticking. Or whatever. Please. I've been married to Reese for 5 years. And yes, I love him. But love isn't everything, you know? There's so much more that goes into a successful marriage than just feelings. It requires structure, management, and vision. I work as a museum curator. I manage delicate artifacts and million-euro budgets. Reese is a financial analyst. He's always been the steady type, which is nice. But sometimes I wonder if steady is just another word for docile. Don't get me wrong, he's sweet and loyal, but he's also the kind of guy who asks me what tie he should wear to a board meeting every single morning. Like, he can't make a decision without my silent approval. At first, I thought it was thoughtful, a sign of respect for my opinion. But honestly, sometimes I just want him to show some initiative, some backbone, and pick the damn tie himself. He does this with everything, too. Always checking with me about which investment to make, where we should go on holiday, what would make me happy. It's like he's constantly seeking my validation, which I guess is flattering in a way, but also kind of exhausting for the one who has to provide the validation. I mean, I appreciate that he cares about my opinion, but does he have to ask about literally everything? Throughout our relationship, I've always been the one who needed more assurance about where we were headed. I'd ask him constantly if he was happy, if he saw a future with me, if he was absolutely sure about us. But when he'd try to turn it around and ask me the same questions, I'd get defensive. Like, why does he need to know every detail of how I'm feeling? Can't he just trust that I'm with him because I want to be? I've always been someone who needs to feel completely secure before making big moves, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's called being meticulous. Other girls might jump into marriage just because they want a wedding or they're worried about being single, but I'm not like that. I actually think about consequences and compatibility and all the practical stuff that matters in the long run. About a year ago, the dynamic started shifting. Reese, who is usually meticulous in his routine, began coming home late. Not dramatically late, but late enough to disrupt our schedule, to miss the quiet hour we usually had together. The reason? A new project. A complex financial restructuring for a high-profile client. He started making excuses about his phone, too. He'd leave it face down on the counter. Before, he never cared. It was a subtle change, but I picked up on it immediately. I'm observant. Between us, I've also been doing what I call reality checks throughout our marriage. Like, I'd create little situations to see how he'd handle them, just to make sure he was really as committed as he claimed. Nothing major, just small, controlled tests to see if he'd choose me over his friend's pub night, or if he'd get a flicker of jealousy when a patron at the museum talked a little too long to me. I needed to know that he'd fight for me if it came down to it, that he valued our commitment above all else. I think that's pretty normal, actually. Every woman should know where they stand with their man. Sometimes I'd pull back a little emotionally just to see his reaction, and he'd always come running back with more attention and effort. It proved to me that he really cared, even if it stressed him out sometimes. I keep track of things too. Like when he doesn't text me back fast enough, or when he makes plans for his gym session without checking if I had a presentation that night. Not in a crazy way, just mentally noting patterns so I can address them later. He has this habit of dismissing my concerns when I bring stuff up, telling me I'm overthinking or being too sensitive. But I'm not being sensitive. I'm being observant. There's a difference. Our friend group thinks we're this perfect, stable couple, and I work hard to maintain that image because I don't need everyone in our business. But privately, there are definitely things about him that annoy me. He's not ambitious enough, he settles for mediocre too easily, and he doesn't always pick up on social cues the way I wish he would. When we're out with people, I sometimes have to subtly guide conversations or cover for his awkward moments. It's not that he's a bad guy. He's just not as polished as I'd like him to be. The other women in our group are always going on about how lucky I am and what a catch he is, which honestly gets on my nerves because they only see the surface level stuff. They don't live with his flaws every day like I do. They don't see how he sometimes forgets to close the filing cabinet or how he can be totally oblivious when I'm trying to hint at something I want. But whatever. I smile and play the happy wife because that's what you do. It was around the time of his big restructuring project that I found the first real clue. He'd fallen asleep early, exhausted from his supposed long days, and his phone, which he'd tucked under a cushion, briefly lit up with a notification. It was a text message from Fiona Artcons. The content: project complete. I've already sent the final report. Thanks again for staying so late with me. Couldn't have done it without your insights, Reese. Drink soon? I felt a cold shock. Fiona, an art conservator from the financial firm's client side. Someone whose job required delicacy and a sophisticated eye, much like mine. Someone who saw him at his most professional and insightful. My first thought wasn't that they were having an affair. My first thought was, he's hiding something. Why would he need to stay so late with her? And why did he never mention her name? I slid the phone back under the cushion. I was breathing quickly, but I was calm. I wasn't jealous. I was analytical. This wasn't a gut feeling. This was data. And the data suggested a hole in my marriage security. I decided I needed to know the details. A good curator knows the full provenance of her collection. I waited until the middle of the night, when Reese was in his deepest sleep. I know his passcode, it's our anniversary. Predictable. I went through his phone, meticulously, like I was auditing a ledger. His texts with Fiona were professional, almost painfully so, discussing spreadsheets, tax implications, and meeting times. No red flags. But that just made me more suspicious. An affair isn't sloppy. It's calculated. He must be smart enough to use a separate app, or maybe he's deleting the messages. I wasn't fooled. His innocence only proved his deceit. I looked her up online. Fiona, 20-something, blonde, conventionally attractive, and clearly single. She was tagged in group photos with Reese and other colleagues, always standing close to him, always smiling that eager, bright smile. A vulture. She was clearly using her art conservator title to appear more cultured than she was, to lure in men like Reese who felt stifled by structured, real women like me. My blood ran cold, but my mind was sharp. I wasn't angry at Reese yet. I was angry at her for introducing a variable into my perfect equation. My reality checks escalated. I started making unannounced appearances at his office. Oh, darling. I was just passing by on my way to the gallery. I thought I'd bring you lunch. I'd linger, watching how he interacted with his colleagues. I watched how Reese and Fiona would laugh at some inside work joke. They exchanged a look, a quick, conspiratorial glance, and I filed it away. I started testing his loyalties in conversation. I'd mention hypothetical situations involving infidelity. My friend, Simone, her husband was having a work affair. Can you believe the audacity? What do you think makes a man do that, Reese? Is it boredom? Is it selfishness? Reese would shift uncomfortably. He'd say, Kaylin, I don't know. People are complicated. Can we please talk about something else? His discomfort, his eagerness to change the subject, was all the confirmation I needed. A truly innocent man would argue the point with moral certainty. His evasiveness proved his guilt. I felt my control slipping because his behavior wasn't following my script. He was pulling away, not running back. He was tired, but not from chasing me, from defending himself. I was frustrated. I was putting in so much emotional effort to monitor this situation, to protect our marriage, and he was punishing me with distance. I became obsessed with the details. One night, Reese came home smelling faintly of perfume that wasn't mine. He claimed it was a colleague standing too close in the lift. I didn't believe him. I know what an innocent man smells like. An innocent man smells like his office and the metro. He doesn't smell like a cheap floral bouquet. I confronted him about his tired eyes. Are you tired from working, Reese? Or are you tired from lying to me? He finally snapped. I am tired, Kaylin. I'm exhausted from walking on eggshells around you. You accuse me of everything. You check my phone. You show up at my work. I feel like I'm under surveillance. Stop being so dramatic. Dramatic. That word stung. I wasn't being dramatic. I was being meticulous. I told him, my voice dangerously calm, if you had nothing to hide, you wouldn't feel the need to shout at me. You are deflecting, Reese, and I refuse to be gaslighted by you. He just stared at me, his face drawn, and that night, for the first time in our 5-year marriage, he didn't sleep in our bed. He slept on the sofa in the lounge. I didn't try to stop him. I let him go. I needed him to understand the weight of his actions. I needed him to come crawling back, apologizing for his outburst and his supposed affair. But he didn't. He stayed in the lounge. The air in our apartment became thick, cold, and utterly silent. He had built a wall, and I felt a mix of fury and fear. Fury that he had the audacity, and fear that I was losing the leverage I needed to control him. I had to find real proof. This quiet rebellion of his was intolerable. The catalyst finally came a week later. I was collecting his dry cleaning receipt from his suit pocket before sending it out. The receipt wasn't for dry cleaning. It was a receipt from the Gilded Swan, a pretentious little French bistro downtown dinner for two. Dated last Tuesday, the night he had told me he was in a 9 o'clock meeting that ran late. That was it. That was the data point I needed. No more speculation. Dinner for two, at a romantic restaurant, on a night he lied about. The proof was right there in my hand. I didn't wait. I didn't scream. I walked into the living room where he was reading a book, tossed the receipt onto his chest, and watched him pale. The Gilded Swan? Reese? Dinner for two. 9 o'clock meeting, you said? Was it the financial restructuring you were dining with? Or was it little Fiona? My voice was low, cutting, and utterly devastating. I was a goddess of judgment. Reese looked at the receipt, then back at me. He didn't stutter. He didn't look guilty. He looked profoundly weary. Yes, Kaylin. It was the Gilded Swan. He rubbed his temples. It was a team dinner. There were 4 of us. The project director, another analyst, Fiona, and me. We finished the deal. It was a small celebration. The receipt only shows the number of main courses, Kaylin. I didn't tell you because you would have called the restaurant to cross-reference the reservations. You would have found a way to turn it into an interrogation. You turn everything into an interrogation. I laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. A team dinner? You expect me to believe you didn't mention it because I would have called the restaurant? No, Reese. You didn't mention it because you were with her, and you knew I would see the lie immediately. You are a terrible liar. I didn't give him a chance to defend himself. I stood over him, pouring 5 years of bottled control into one poisonous speech. I have stood by you. I have polished you. I have managed you into the man you are now. And this is how you repay my effort? By conducting a pathetic midlife work affair with a woman who probably thinks the Renaissance is a type of car? I won't stand for it. His reaction was unexpected. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He simply stood up and looked down at me, his eyes tired and cold. There is no affair, Kaylin. There never was. You need a villain, so you invented one. I am tired of being accused of things I haven't done, and I am tired of having to live my life to meet your surveillance standards. I need space. He walked out of the room, not to the sofa this time, but to the spare bedroom. He locked the door. I stood there, vibrating with a strange mix of triumph and terror. Triumph because I had forced the confession, though not the one I expected, and terror because I had pushed him too far. He was building a fortress against me. I knew I needed to control the narrative immediately. A victim gets sympathy, an aggressor gets scorn. I started my campaign among our mutual friends. I began telling carefully edited versions of our story that made me look reasonable and him look impatient and demanding, and tragically deceitful. He's been acting so distant lately, I'd say, my voice trembling slightly, but my eyes dry. I only asked him a few simple, logical questions about his sudden late nights, and he just withdrew. I think he was covering something up. The financial stress must have driven him to seek validation elsewhere. I emphasized how I just wanted to be absolutely sure about his commitment, how I needed a partner who would respect my need for certainty. I painted myself as the wounded party, the perceptive wife whose husband just couldn't handle the truth. Most of our female friends totally understood my position and were sympathetic. He sounds like a child, Kaylin. They'd commiserate. You were right to question him. The validation felt like a lifeline. I made sure to mention how hurt I was that he'd retreated instead of being patient with someone he claimed to love. I painted myself as the victim of his emotional immaturity. The attention and sympathy felt good. People were checking on me, bringing me wine, validating my feelings about the whole near-cheating situation. I liked having that status, but I was getting frustrated that some people, especially Reese's friends, weren't buying my version of events. They seemed to think he'd been more than patient and that I'd had 5 years to figure out my feelings. Whatever. They were clearly biased toward him. Meanwhile, my obsession with Reese and Fiona intensified. I stalked his social media constantly, looking for signs that he was missing me or regretting his decision. I was waiting for the apology, the inevitable. I messed up. I need you, Kaylin. But the reports I was getting back were not what I wanted to hear. According to our friends, Reese seemed to be doing fine. He wasn't posting sad songs or moping around like I expected. Instead, he appeared to be focusing on himself, hanging out with his buddies, and even seeming happier, according to some people. This made me absolutely furious. How dare he act like losing me was no big deal? How could he seem better off without me when I'd been the best thing in his life for 5 years? I'd made him. I started planting subtle criticisms about him in conversations with our friend group. Nothing too obvious, just little comments about his communication issues, his emotional immaturity, his inability to handle a strong woman who knew her own mind. I wanted people to understand that maybe this breakdown was actually his fault, not mine. I needed to control how people saw our relationship and make sure they didn't think he was some kind of martyr. As the weeks went by without any contact from him, he was still in the spare room, but we communicated via terse, formal notes. My anger intensified. I felt like he was being childish and stubborn, punishing me for being honest about my feelings. I convinced myself that he was the problem, that he obviously couldn't handle being with someone who had standards and expectations. If he really loved me, he would have been willing to endure my reality checks as long as it took for me to feel ready to trust him again. But instead, he threw away 5 years because he couldn't be patient for a few more months while I investigated his fidelity. I started planning ways to force contact with him. I even considered sending him a dramatic letter explaining how hurt I was by his abandonment and how he'd misunderstood my need for time. I was becoming obsessed with proving that he still needed me and that walking away was a mistake he'd eventually regret. My chance came with the annual financial sector gala. I knew Reese would be there. I wasn't invited, but as a respected curator, I could certainly get an invitation to the venue's open event on the same night. I spent an hour preparing my look. I needed to look untouchable, elegant, and perfectly tragic. I was a wounded queen. I needed him to see what he was losing. I arrived late, making sure my entrance was noticed. I was immediately surrounded by friends, all offering sympathetic murmurs. I played the part beautifully. Then I saw him. Reese. He was across the room, talking to a group of colleagues. And right beside him, looking radiant in a sapphire dress, was Fiona. My blood ran cold, but I smiled widely. They hadn't seen me yet. I walked toward them, slow and deliberate, a predator in a ball gown. I greeted Reese first, my voice dripping with honeyed condescension. "Reese, darling, you clean up well. I was just passing by, you know, the usual, and thought I'd pop in. You must be relieved to have the spare room all to yourself now." He looked at me, not with anger, but with profound embarrassment. "Kaylin, this is a work event." I turned my attention to Fiona, who was holding a glass of champagne, her face a mask of polite neutrality. "And you must be Fiona," I said, offering a smile that didn't reach my eyes. "The art conservator. I hear you and Reese are quite the team these days. I do hope you remember the difference between professional collaboration and personal boundaries. Some men can be terribly confusing about that." Fiona, bless her cotton socks, didn't flinch. She simply looked me in the eye and said, with a quiet firmness, "Reese and I are very clear on our boundaries, Kaylin. We're focused on the firm's success." I laughed, a tiny, dismissive sound. "Of course, dear. Success. Reese, we need to talk later. Don't worry about her." I waved a hand dismissively at Fiona. "I'll call you. We need to work out the details of the separation. You can't just run away from your responsibilities." The scene I created was spectacular. Everyone was watching. I had cemented my status as the wronged wife and publicly shamed Reese. I had won, but I hadn't. Reese didn't follow me. He didn't call. The next day, I received a short email from his personal account. It wasn't an apology. It was the name and number of his divorce attorney. He was proceeding with separation. I was completely shocked. I'd never seen him stand firm like that before, and I didn't know how to handle a version of Reese who wouldn't bend to my will. I'd lost my anchor. The aftermath of Reese sending the attorney's details was complete chaos, but not in the way anyone expected. I wasn't devastated about losing the love of my life. I was furious about losing control of the situation and the narrative. My first instinct was to blame everyone else for this mess. His friends should have talked sense into him instead of encouraging his ultimatum. His family probably supported his decision to leave me, even though they barely knew me. Fiona must have been filling his head with ideas about what he deserved, making him think he was too good for someone who just needed more time. I was shocked that he didn't come crawling back within a few days like he always did after our fights. Usually, he was the one who apologized first, who reached out to fix things between us. I'd gotten used to him being the peacemaker in our relationship, and I expected him to realize he was being dramatic and come back to work things out. But days turned into a week, then 2 weeks, and still nothing. He only communicated through his solicitor. I became obsessed with monitoring what Reese was doing. I stalked his social media constantly, but he was barely posting. I had to know the truth. I couldn't bear the ambiguity anymore. The financial cost didn't matter. I needed the final, damning piece of evidence that Reese had betrayed me. I hired a private investigator. A good one. I gave him the details. Track Reese. Confirm the relationship with Fiona. Get proof of infidelity. I told myself it was for the divorce settlement, but really, it was for my ego. I needed to be proven right. 6 weeks later, the investigator sent me his report. The file was clinical, detailed, and absolutely soul-destroying in a way I hadn't anticipated. First, the attorney. Reese had been meeting with a divorce attorney. Yes, but not a year ago, as I had suspected, but 2 weeks before I found the receipt from the Gilded Swan. He had already made the decision to leave because of the constant accusations. Second, Fiona. The investigator's report contained dozens of photos and logs. Reese and Fiona were seen together. Yes, but always with at least one other colleague. The dinner at the Gilded Swan had been a celebratory team dinner, exactly as Reese had claimed. The receipt for 2 main courses meant they only had 2 main courses. Not that only 2 people were present, the other 2 had appetizers. The investigator even had photos of the 4 of them leaving together. There was no secret rendezvous. There was no late-night hotel visit. There was no damning photo. The cruelest truth was laid bare. There was no affair. I hadn't been an observant wife protecting her marriage. I had been a paranoid, controlling monster who had manufactured a crisis. And Reese's silence, his weariness, his withdrawal, it wasn't the guilt of a cheater. It was the exhaustion of a good man who had been pushed past his breaking point by relentless, unfounded suspicion. I didn't feel relief. I felt a cold, blinding rage. How dare he be innocent? How dare he make me look like a fool? By not cheating, he had ruined my narrative. He had betrayed me more deeply than any affair ever could. I immediately tore up the investigator's report. It was lies. He had been bribed. Reese had obviously paid him off. It was the only logical conclusion. My instinct, my data, was never wrong. Reese was a master manipulator, and this was his final, slickest move to make me look crazy. I filed my counterpetition for divorce, citing emotional distress and his suspect professional conduct with a coworker. I needed to control the final outcome. I needed to win. 6 months after Reese walked out, the universe decided to completely destroy my life in the most painful way possible. I found out through social media that Reese wasn't just moving on. He was absolutely thriving without me. A few weeks after the divorce was final, photos of him and Fiona started appearing on his profile. It was discreet at first, but it quickly became obvious they were together. Fiona worked as a respected art conservator. She was professional, wholesome, and annoyingly supportive. And from what I could see, she seemed disgustingly sweet. But what really killed me wasn't just that he was with someone else. It was how completely different their relationship looked from ours. In every photo, they both looked genuinely happy and relaxed. There was no drama, no testing, no games. She never posted cryptic quotes about relationships or made passive-aggressive comments about needing space. They just seemed to enjoy each other's company without all the complexity and structure I thought was normal in serious relationships. It looked easy, and that was an insult to my hard work. I spent hours analyzing their social media interactions, looking for signs of problems or incompatibility, but everything seemed disgustingly healthy. I started planting subtle criticisms with mutual friends. It's so rushed. She seems terribly immature. She's clearly desperate for commitment. The devastating blow came when I learned through our mutual friends that Reese had proposed to Fiona after only 7 months together, and she'd said yes immediately. 7 months. I'd had 5 years to figure out my feelings, to perform my reality checks and structural analyses. And this girl knew after less than a year that she wanted to marry him. The engagement announcement was everywhere on social media, with everyone commenting about how perfect they were together and how Fiona clearly knew a good man when she saw one. That last comment felt like a personal attack on me, like they were saying I'd been too stupid to recognize what I had. My own friends began distancing themselves from me as they realized I was being bitter instead of supportive. They started making comments about how I needed to move on and be happy for him, which just made me angrier. Couldn't they see that this whole situation was unfair to me? I had given him 5 years of my management. She gave him 7 months of passive obedience. But the absolute worst part was learning that Reese had gotten promoted at work, was earning nearly 50% more, and was buying a house with Fiona. Everything I'd wanted him to prove to me, all the financial stability, the ambition, the independent drive I had demanded, he was now providing for someone else who'd never asked him to prove anything. Fiona never made him jump through hoops or earn her love through grand gestures. She simply loved him and built a life with him, which apparently was all he'd ever wanted. I discovered that while I'd been testing his devotion and making him work for my approval, she'd been his partner and supporter. While I'd been keeping my options open and maintaining other professional friendships, she'd been building a future with him. While I'd been analyzing every flaw and pushing him to be better, she'd been accepting him as he was and growing with him. It made me sick to realize that everything I thought made me a smart, careful woman, the meticulous planning, the structural analysis, the reality checks, actually made me look like an idiot who didn't know what she had. In my desperation, I made one final attempt to reclaim some control over the situation. I found an old email chain and replied to it, sending Reese a long message, explaining how I was ready now, how I'd realized what I'd lost, and how we could work things out if he was willing to try again. I told him that what we had was real and deep in ways that his new relationship couldn't match, and that Fiona would never understand his complexities like I did. His response was brief and absolutely crushing. He told me he was happy with his life and wished me well, but he wasn't interested in looking backward. He said he hoped I'd find what I was looking for, but it wouldn't be with him. The message was polite but final, and I could tell that I no longer had any power over him whatsoever. I'd become completely irrelevant to his happiness and success. Here I am now, sitting in my apartment, scrolling through photos of their engagement party, consumed with rage and jealousy, but still refusing to admit that any of this is my fault. I'm convinced that Reese was just impatient and couldn't handle being with a woman who had standards. He was weak. Fiona obviously settled for the first decent guy who came along because she's nearly 30, which says more about her desperation than his worth. Our friends chose sides based on superficial stuff, like the fact that Fiona never caused a scene, instead of understanding the real, complex dynamics of our relationship. Society pressures men to find an easy woman, instead of taking time to value the structure and management a strong partner provides. Everyone failed me in this situation, but I'm the one who has to live with the consequences of their shortcomings. I dodged a bullet anyway. If he couldn't wait for me to be ready, if he couldn't handle my standards, he obviously wasn't the right person for me in the first place.